This is African American History is American History. Welcome. I'm your host, Harlan Kearsley. This program's goal is to foster understanding, promote discussion, and expand knowledge through stories of historical events, bios of unsung heroes, as well as timely and relevant news stories which hopefully will paint a vivid picture of the effects of segregation, discrimination, and bigotry on the lives of both blacks and whites. Comparisons will be made between the many racially fractured periods of American history and what's going on right now. This is the story of an escape so daring, it's the stuff big-budget movie blockbusters are made of. But since the hero of the story is a black man who escaped slavery all on his own, you'll more than likely have to wait a while before it plays at your local multiplex or even on Netflix. Robert Smalls was a politician, publisher, businessman, and naval pilot. In fact, Robert Smalls has been and done so many amazing things in his lifetime, it would take at least 5 or 6 episodes to cover them all. So, we're just going to focus on one amazing story in an amazing life. Robert Smalls was born into slavery on April 5, 1839, in Beaufort, South Carolina. His mother was Lydia Polite, a 43-year-old house servant, which was a coveted spot in the hierarchy of slaves in the South. She named her baby Robert Smalls. Lydia Polite was owned by Henry McKee, who owned the very large Ashdale plantation in South Carolina. To this day, it's not clear as to the identity of Robert Smalls' father. However, a number of biographers speculate that it was the master of the house, Henry McKee. Now, this is a plausible speculation considering that since his birth, McKee treated young Robert differently from the other slaves. He served as a supportive father figure, yet only taught him just enough so that he was semi-literate. Even though Lydia Polite lived as a servant in the house, she had grown up in the fields. She knew and understood the plight of the field slaves, and she wanted young Robert to understand that as well. She took the boy to see slave auctions, and even asked her master, Henry McKee, to send young Robert to work in the fields. Robert Smalls saw firsthand the indignity, the brutality, and the anguish of life as a slave. Smalls' mother also instilled a strong sense of religion in him. He grew up in the geographic and cultural region along South Carolina's coast, known as the Low Country Gullah. The Gullah developed a Creole language, also called Gullah, and their culture has many African influences. This was the culture of his mother. When Robert Smalls was 12, at the request of his mother, their master, Henry McKee, sent young Robert to Charleston to hire out as a laborer for $1 a week, with the rest of the wage being paid to McKee. Robert Smalls first worked in a hotel. Then he became a lamplighter on Charleston's streets. In his teen years, his love of the sea led him to find work on Charleston's docks. There, Smalls worked as a longshoreman, a rigger, a sailmaker, and eventually worked his way up to become a wheelman. That's more or less a helmsman. You see, slaves were not permitted the title of helmsman. As time went on, Robert Smalls became extremely knowledgeable about Charleston's harbor. On December 24, 1856, at the age of 17, Smalls married Hannah Jones an enslaved hotel maid in Charleston. She was 5 years his senior and already had 2 daughters. Their own first child, Elizabeth Lydia Smalls, was born in February of 1858. 3 years later, they had a son, Robert Jr., who later died at the age of 2. Robert Smalls, like so many enslaved people, constantly worried that at any time his family, his wife, his children, could be sold. And once separated, Smalls knew it would most likely be that he would never see them again. So, Smalls planned to pay for their freedom by purchasing them outright. But the price was steep, $800. That would be the equivalent of $26,690.15 in 2021 dollars. In 5 years, he had managed to save only $100. At that rate, it would take him decades to reach his goal. In April 1861, the Civil War began with the Battle of Fort Sumter in nearby Charleston Harbor. In the fall of 1861, Smalls was assigned to steer a lightly armored Confederate military transport steamer named the CSS Planter. The Planter was under the command of Charleston's District Commander, Brigadier General Roswell S. Ripley. The Planter's duties were to deliver dispatches, troops, and supplies, to survey waterways, and to lay mines. Smalls piloted the Planter throughout Charleston Harbor and beyond, on area rivers and along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts. From Charleston Harbor, Smalls and the Planter's crew could see the line of Federal blockade ships in the outer harbor, 7 miles away. By April of 1862, Robert Smalls had gained the confidence of the Planter's crew and owners. He kept up his appearance of contentment, all the while planning an escape. He discussed the matter with the other slaves in the crew, except one, whom he did not trust. On May 12, 1862, the Planter traveled 10 miles southwest of Charleston to stop at Coles Island, a Confederate post on the Stono River that was being dismantled. There, the ship picked up 4 large guns to transport to a fort in Charleston Harbor. Back in Charleston, the crew loaded 200 pounds of ammunition and 20 cords of firewood onto the Planter. On the evening of May 12th, the Planter was docked as usual at the wharf below General Ripley's headquarters. Its 3 white officers disembarked to spend the night ashore. Now, since they had complete trust in Smalls, they had absolutely no problem leaving him and the rest of the slave crew on board. But before the officers departed, Smalls asked Captain Charles C.J. Raillier if the crew's families could visit, which was occasionally allowed. Captain Raillier approved, on the condition that they depart before curfew. When the families arrived, Robert Smalls revealed the plan to them. This was the first the women and children had heard of it. Although Smalls recently had told his wife Hannah, she was just as shocked as the other women when Smalls first told her of the
escape? Robert, I never dreamed you actually worked out a plan, much less intended to carry it out. Oh, my love, I know how you've always longed for freedom. I want that too, and I surely want that for our children. But I won't lie to you. I'm scared for them, too. It's a big risk.
The bigger risk is not going. Hannah, I know you're scared. I am, too. I have to do this. But if it means leaving you and the children behind, I can't. I just can't do that. Please come with me.
All right. I love you, Robert. Where you go, we go. We mustn't be separated. You, Me, our children, our family should be free. Live or die, we must be free.
This is African American History is American History. When the families arrived, Robert Smalls revealed the plan to them. The women and children cried and screamed when they learned what they had stumbled into, and the men struggled to quiet them. Later, once the shock had worn off, the women admitted that they were glad for a chance at freedom. At some point, 3 crew members pretended to escort family members back home, but circled around and hid aboard another steamer docked at the North Atlantic Wharf. At about 3 a.m. on May 13th, Smalls and 7 of the 8 slave crewmen made their planned escape to the Union blockade ships. Smalls put on the captain's uniform and wore a straw hat similar to Captain Relier's. He sailed the planter past what was then called Southern Wharf, and stopped at another wharf to pick up his wife and children and the families of other crewmen. Smalls guided the ship past the 5 Confederate harbor forts, giving all the correct signals at checkpoints. And with the captain's straw hat and coat on, he managed to fool the Confederate onlookers from shore and the forts. The planter sailed past Fort Sumter at about 4:30 a.m. As the nearly free slaves approached Fort Sumter, their apprehension began to grow. It was the most heavily armed of the forts and tended to be manned by the most suspicious soldiers. One of the men aboard later said, "When we drew near the fort, every man but Robert Smalls felt his knees giving way, and the women began crying and praying again." As the planter approached the fort, several men urged Smalls to give it a wide berth. Smalls refused, saying that such behavior would almost certainly arouse suspicion. He steered the ship along its normal path, slowly, as though he were merely enjoying the early morning air and in no particular hurry. When Fort Sumter flashed the challenge signal, Smalls again gave the correct hand signs. There was a long pause. The fort didn't immediately respond, and Smalls now expected cannon fire to shred the planter to bits at any moment. Finally, the fort signaled that all was well, and Smalls sailed his ship out of the harbor. The alarm was only raised after the ship was beyond gun range. Rather than turn eastward towards Morris Island, Smalls had headed straight for the Union Navy fleet, replacing the rebel flags with a white bedsheet which was brought by his wife. The CSS Planter had been seen by the USS Onward, which was about to open fire, until a crewman spotted the white flag. In the dark, the sheet was difficult to see, but thankfully, the sunrise arrived, making it clearly visible. As one witness account put it,
"Just as our number 3 port gun was being elevated, someone cried out, 'I see something that looks like a white flag.' And, true enough, there was something flying on that steamer that would have been white by application of soap and water. As she neared us, we looked in vain for the face of a white man. When they discovered that we would not fire on them, there was a rush of contrabands out on her deck, some dancing, some singing, whistling, jumping, and others stood looking towards Fort Sumter and muttering all sorts of maledictions against it. As the steamer came near, and under the stern of the Onward, one of the colored men stepped forward and, taking off his hat, shouted,
'Good morning, sir. I brought you some of the old United States guns. I'm sure you can put them to use, sir.'"
That man was Robert Smalls. The Onward's captain, John Frederick Nichols, boarded the planter, and Smalls asked for a United States flag to display. He surrendered the planter and its cargo to the United States Navy. The CSS Planter was now the USS Planter, and Robert Smalls' escape plan had succeeded. In addition to its own light guns, the planter carried the 4 loose artillery pieces from Coles Island and the 200 pounds of ammunition. But most valuable was was the captain's code book, containing the Confederate signals and a map of the mines and torpedoes that had been laid in Charleston's harbor. Small's extensive knowledge of the Charleston region's waterways and military configurations also proved highly valuable. The planter was forwarded to Flag Officer Samuel DuPont, who described Smalls as very intelligent. Smalls gave detailed information about Charleston's defenses to DuPont, who was commander of the blockading fleet. DuPont was impressed, and he expressed that in the following report to the Navy Secretary in Washington, in which DuPont stated, "Robert, the intelligent slave and pilot of the boat, who performed this bold feat so skillfully, informed me of the capture of the Sumter gun, presuming it would be a matter of interest. He is superior to any of the contraband who have come into our lines, and seems more intelligent than many of them have been." After his escape, Smalls served as a pilot for Union ships in the Charleston area. He was eventually assigned to serve aboard the planter again. By 1862, Smalls, at only 23, quickly became known in the North as a hero for his daring exploit. Newspapers and magazines reported his actions. The U.S. Congress passed a bill awarding Smalls and his crewmen the prize money for the capture of the planter. The vessel was valuable not only for its guns, but low draft in Charleston Bay. Southern newspapers demanded harsh discipline for the Confederate officers whose joint shore leave had allowed the slaves to steal the boat. Small's share of the prize money came to $1,500. Now, that would be the equivalent of $47,602.87 in 2021 dollars. Immediately after the capture, Smalls was invited to travel to New York to help raise money for ex-slaves. On December 1st, 1863, the planter was caught in a crossfire between the Union and Confederate forces. The ship's commander ordered the planter's crew to surrender. Smalls refused, saying he feared her black crewmen would not be treated as prisoners of war and that they might be killed on the spot. Smalls took command and piloted the ship out of range of the Confederate guns. For his bravery, he was appointed captain of the planter, becoming the first black man to command a United States ship. Smalls served as captain until the Army sold the planter in 1866. Immediately following the war, Smalls returned to his native Beaufort, where he purchased his former master's house at 511 Prince Street, which Union tax authorities had seized in 1863 for refusal to pay taxes. Later, the former owner sued to regain the property, but Smalls retained ownership in the court case. That case became an important precedent in other similar cases. His mother, Lydia, lived with him for the remainder of her life. He allowed his former master's wife, the elderly Jane Bond McKee, to move into her former home prior to her death. Robert Smalls spent 9 months learning to read and write, and hired a teacher to help him study. He purchased a 2-story building to use as a school for African American children. In 1866, Smalls went into business in Beaufort with Richard Howell Gleaves, a businessman from Philadelphia. They opened a store to serve the needs of freedmen. In April of 1866, the Republicans, who were in control of Congress, overrode President Andrew Johnson's vetoes and passed a Civil Rights Act. In 1868, they passed the 14th Amendment, which was ratified by the states to extend full citizenship to all Americans, regardless of race. Also, Robert Smalls was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. He was very effective and introduced the Homestead Act, which provided that any adult citizen or intended citizen, regardless of color, who had never borne arms against the U.S. government, could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. Smalls also introduced and worked to pass the Civil Rights Bill. In 1870, Jonathan Jasper Wright was elected judge of the South Carolina Supreme Court, and Smalls was elected to fill his unexpired time in the Senate. Smalls continued in the Senate, winning the 1872 election against W.J. Whipper. In the Senate, Robert Smalls was considered an excellent speaker and debater. He was on the Finance Committee and chairman of the Public Printing Committee. In 1915, at the age of 75, Robert Smalls died of malaria and diabetes. He was buried in his family's plot in the churchyard of the Tabernacle Baptist Church in downtown Beaufort, South Carolina. The monument to Smalls in this churchyard is inscribed with a statement he made to the South Carolina legislature in 1895.
My race needs no special defense. The past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life.
This has been African American History is American History. The episode you've been listening to, Robert Smalls and the Planter, was written and directed by Harlan Kearsley. The actors were Robert McKay as Robert Smalls, Soraya Butler as Hannah Smalls, and Jeffrey Shupert as the Union Navy witness. I'm Harlan Kearsley, and on behalf of everyone here at African American History is American History, thank you for listening. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe. Once you do, you'll be notified as new episodes are posted. Thanks again, and please stay safe. African American History is American History. Copyright H.C. Kearsley, 2021.